manager at the centre. A grief that I'm only marginally glad to say was nothing to do with my script. I tell you now, it was impossible not to wonder how on earth those currently, and I hope temporarily, in charge of the BBC could have brought such things to such a miserably demeaning condition. My impression was that there's now a one-way system of communication, and the signals being sent down the narrowed track were so laden with costive blurb and bubble-driven didacticism that they were more than half perceived as emanating in a squeak of static from someone, or rather something, alien and hostile. And you cannot make a pair of Croak-voiced Daleks appear benevolent, even if you dress one of them in an Armani suit and call the other Marmaduke.
Hello. So is it gratifying or worrying to Britain's television professionals that the opening lecture at the annual festival here in Edinburgh should be knocked from the top news slot over the weekend only by the prospects for peace in Bosnia? Are we dangerously parochial and self-regarding? Or is the future of British broadcasting so important and so imperiled by present changes that we rightly open up the doors of this normally closed event to involve you in what might seem like private grief? Should we care that one of Britain's most distinguished and successful television and film writers declares that if he was starting from here, he wouldn't? This Right to Reply special from the Edinburgh International Television Festival concentrates on the argument of Dennis Potter's MacTaggart Memorial Lecture and offers the right to reply to the television professionals gathered in Edinburgh. It's a break with tradition, of course, to give professionals rather than viewers the right to reply, but once a year, why not let the inmates run the asylum? Perhaps appropriately, we are in the Great Hall of the Royal College of Physicians. So shall we heal ourselves? Can we? Michael Eaton.
Up at this festival, at the moment, there's a section of it called Television and Young People, and I was doing a couple of sessions on that on Friday with a group of people in their teens who are desperate to be television playwrights, television dramatists, and you know, the enthusiasm and the literacy for our medium that these people.
Well, of course, yeah. When I said at the lecture that I probably wouldn't choose television above all else,
yes,
which is what I did,
yes.
It's because of the way it's run, organized, structured. Of course, the writers are out there, waiting, yearning to put what they think, believe, feel into their scripts, their plays. Except it's not writer-driven anymore.
But what other medium, if you were starting out now, then would you recommend to get that relationship with an audience?
The whole damn thing on Friday, which has exhausted me enough. I don't want to go through it all again. But what I do know is that the program makers seem secondary to cost accountants and commissioning editors. And the syntax, the grammar of when you have to look at the label on the door to know whether you're the BBC or Carlton or, you know, wherever. It has changed so much in my own memory and my own experience that it's not writer-driven. You know, it's not... the atmosphere has shifted, and the ground has shifted. That's what I meant about if I were starting now, in my early 20s, I wouldn't feel the same passionate need to commit to this medium. So,
Will Wyatt.
I think it's true that there has been a switch away from the power of the writer over the past 20 years, without a doubt. And I think television has become more producer-driven and more director-driven
and more accountant-driven. Yeah.
Well, it's certainly producer-driven and director-driven, but I sense a change in that
and
at the moment, actually.
Driven.
Well,
yes.
I think so. Only in that people have to know is the money to make a programme, and if there is, we can make it, and if there
isn't producer choice really actually accountant choice? I mean, isn't producer choice one of the great cant words of our time? It's not actually producer choice, is it?
It is producer choice. If we want to discuss producer choice, please let's. Just cheap jibes about the number of jobs that have gone. It is a cheap jibe. We have to have 25% independent production. You have to, in order to do that, you cannot keep everybody employed and operate at the same scale. We've had to slim down in order to do that. We didn't volunteer to do that. And it's caused a lot of pain. A lot of good people have gone, and no one has really liked that. So, there have been other benefits as well, but that was not something the BBC imposed upon itself.
So would you like that legislation revoked?
No, it's there now, and I think what the independents have done for British broadcasting is fantastically valuable, and I think they brought a lot of things to the BBC's programming that we wouldn't otherwise have had. But I cannot put up with cheap jibes about how many jobs we've got. Simply on the, yes, it is a cheap jibe.
What's the cheap jibe?
The cheap jibe is that it was not something that we chose to do, it was something that we had to do.
It's something you half chose to do.
No, we didn't.
The defence the BBC
Well, there's
put
some independents in this room, and some of the people who argue for this, and I think they know.
Let's open it up.
That's the cabaret. Now let's hear, yes, from the people, yes.
Cheap jibes.
I think one of the problems, Dennis, with what you said on Friday was you were in danger of mixing up the personalities and the policies. Really, if John Birt went tomorrow, the man on whom you launched a splenetic attack on Friday, although we'd run out of champagne in White City, I think it's fairly predictable that a lot of the things that have been introduced at the BBC over the last year would remain in place, and the BBC would chunter down a path which some people predict leads to oblivion. The reason for that, as you quite rightly pinned down, was the political reality, where the BBC has actually taken on the free market concepts, the new language, and all those rather worn-out ideas that were introduced at the fag end of Thatcherism, quite frankly. And it's for that reason, I think, that we've got to define the problem at the BBC, if there is one, not as a problem just of the people at the top, but actually a problem of the culture and the politics of the society that the BBC is operating in right now.
One of the reasons I used the kind of language I did is I'm sick of this sort of meta-language of British public discourse, in which ideas, in quotes, are apparently shuffled about without attaching them to the people who are operating them. So that's why I also feel sorry for John Birt. Got no personal animus whatsoever. The point is, the BBC cannot assume that it and public service broadcasting are synonymous. That's been one of the problems over the, if you look like way back to the Beveridge Report on 1949, the Annan, 1977, lost opportunities to define those thousands of millions of pounds of licence fee. Is the BBC to do everything?
Michael Gray, last year you gave an equally impassioned lecture on the necessity of sustaining the best of the BBC for the good of all broadcasting and for the good of democracy. Very similar theme. So specifically, what would or wouldn't you do, given that these specifics are coming up?
I think Dennis went much deeper in his lecture to the heart of the unease that people feel. I rather skimmed over the surface of the detail. Dennis has gone, I think, right to the heart of the issue. I'm not saying he's right, I'm not saying he's wrong, but he's certainly identified the core of the issue. And I think there is a groundswell of disappointment that at a crucial time when the BBC's future is up for grabs, as it were, that it seems so hell-bent on its own survival, which any institution, that's its first instinct, that it has lost sight of the greater public interest in the BBC, which is this an opportunity for the BBC to argue a case on behalf of the public, to get it out of the hands of the politicians, to get the licence fee out of the hands of the politicians. The BBC serves its customers, its licence payers in one way, but its paymasters are the cabinet. That's who the paymasters of the BBC are. And one wishes that the BBC's argument for its future would lift itself beyond producer choice and the market jargon that they seem to have embraced so willingly in order to ensure their own survival. And I think what came through to me from Dennis was a sense of enormous disappointment that the BBC was not reaching for those bigger, wider issues.
Hence your title, Occupying Powers, and you effectively admitted earlier on. I mean, we didn't have to do. We had to do this. We didn't want to do this necessarily, but we had to do this. Don't blame us. I mean, it does sound like appeasement.
No, appeasement. If the law says you've got to have 25% independence, and the industry as a whole, I think by and large thought that that was generally a good idea, and then the law said it. It's not appeasement to obey the law. That's a citizen's common duty. And there's now I think Michael's put his finger on something quite important here. I wouldn't pretend that we haven't had a jargon too far or two. And I think if you're making change, and you're trying to change